Hello there, and welcome back. I'm Martin, and today on Daddy Rolled a One, we're going to be talking about Dragon Magazine. This is a topic that so many of you said you wanted to see me cover when you were commenting on my 5,000 subscriber giveaway contest video, and so I wanted to oblige those requests, and it's also something that is I'm very super interested in covering. So I got my first issue of Dragon, which is this one right here, back in, this is August of 1983. And so I would have gotten this for my birthday that year. It was a gift from a friend, I recall. And I had never really paid attention to Dragon. I had seen, I think, a flyer in my box set, from my Moldvay Basic box set, but never really paid attention. I'd never seen the magazine in the store because I wasn't really looking for it. And so I got this with this very striking cover by Clyde Caldwell. And I think this was the first Clyde Caldwell painting I had ever seen. And I just fell in love with the magazine. It just has so many pages. It's chock full. This one is almost, it's probably 92 pages here, 96. And it had so much information in here, and at a price of $3, where the average adventure at this time was, or modules, they called them, were selling for like $6, and they were less than half of the size of one of these. So I loved this. And so the next time I went to the store with my mom, she went to the mall, and I went to the Walden Books like I usually did. But instead of visiting the fantasy book section or looking at the D&D games in the game section, I went to the magazine rack, and I saw they had issues of Dragon. And so I started trying to buy back issues and building up my collection. So starting with issue number 90, my grandmother had given me a subscription for my birthday, and she kept that subscription up until she passed away in the early 90s. And then at that point, I took it over, and I kept that subscription up all the way until the very last print issue, which was number 359 in 2007. So in this video series, or it's really a sub-series of my main series on the history of early tabletop role-playing games, including Dungeons and Dragons. So what I'm going to do is talk about some of the influences in the wargaming magazine industry that influenced TSR and Gary Gygax and his team to want to start publishing a magazine. We're going to talk about the very first version of the magazine that was published, which was called the Strategic Review. And in this particular video today, that's really what I'm going to focus on. I'm going to cover all 7 issues of the Strategic Review and talk about how those influenced the later creation of Dragon Magazine. In future videos of the series, again, I will be talking about how Strategic Review was split into 2 magazines, Dragon and one called Little Wars. I'm going to talk about, why they did that. We're going to cover each year of Dragon in 12 issue segments, talk about the content that was in there and how some of that content then became a core part of D&D. So a lot of the monsters, the classes, the spells, treasures, things like that, magic items, the Forgotten Realms itself, all of that had its first debut in Dragon Magazine, a lot of it. And so things that we take for granted today, you're going to see the origin of them as we go through this series with Dragon Magazine. I'm also going to talk about the people who edited the magazine, some of the writers, the creators, and the artists. And we're going to see how different editors, sort of their vision, how it changed Dragon over time. And then as we keep going with the series, we're going to talk about how Dragon itself was eventually split into 2 sister publications, Dragon and Dungeon, and then how there was a period of time where we went 5 months without getting an issue of Dragon, and that was because at the time TSR was being acquired by Wizards of the Coast. Wizards of the Coast starts publishing the magazine again, and then eventually it is licensed out to a company called Paizo Publishing, and Paizo then publishes Dragon and Dungeon throughout the remainder of the print issues, again until 2007 when their license was revoked. But their publication of Dragon and Dungeon was directly responsible for Paizo then creating the Pathfinder role-playing game. If a lot of you have heard of that. Okay, so that's kind of a look ahead at like what we're going to be covering. But like I said, today we're going to be talking about the Strategic Review, which was the predecessor magazine to Dragon. Now, at this time, D&D, was founded in 1974. However, Gary and his friends and comrades had been making games going back much earlier than that. So Chainmail was made in 1971 for a company called Guidon Games. And so he was in the wargaming industry, and wargaming at this time, it was kind of starting to reach the peak of its popularity. So we're talking about miniatures war games, or also war games that were played with cardboard pieces, chits, and hex maps. Okay, so there were some magazines that, and I'm not going to go over every magazine, okay, but I'm just going to kind of hit some highlights to kind of explain what was going on. So there was a game company called Avalon Hill, and they were probably at the time sort of the main publisher of these types of war games, okay? So Avalon Hill was publishing war games, and they put out a magazine called The General. Now, throughout the history of this magazine, it kind of changed names, but it always involved the name General. So I'm just going to call it The General. And it had started publishing in 1964, and it covered Avalon Hill's games and talked about military, things that were pertinent to the games that it was publishing. Okay, so you have basically a magazine dedicated to a subset of board gaming, which is these war games, these very like military war games. Okay, so that was Avalon Hill's publication. All right. And it really covered, it was the first professionally produced magazine that was created to cover the kind of the cardboard and hex map games that were becoming very, very popular. All right. So then what happened? Of course, you need to have competition. So there is another magazine that gets started, and it starts out as a zine. It starts out as, sort of like a fan publication, and it was called Strategy and Tactics. And it was popular, but it started to lose its circulation. And so there were some people that were fans of the magazine that wanted to keep it going. And so they created a whole new company that was called Simulations Publications, Inc., or later just known as SPY. And that company was created specifically to take over Strategy and Tactics magazine and make it sort of less of a zine and more of a professional publication. And so as that magazine goes along, it starts in 1967. It became famous for publishing in every single issue. It published a full board game, with all the pieces, the cardboard pieces and everything like that, and the maps, so you could play this game. And so that magazine sort of became like the flagship offering from SPY, even though SPY was also publishing standalone war games that you could, just go buy at the store as well. A lot of those standalone games actually had their beginnings as the insert game within Strategy and Tactics. Okay, so you have this idea that there's a magazine out there that every month is publishing a game. That's going to be important as we get into Dragon, all right? And especially in Dragon's kind of like later history. So eventually, just to kind of give you like a little some context. At its height, Strategy and Tactics circulation was about 30,000 people, and that was considered huge at the time because, again, it is a very niche hobby. They started to publish sort of different magazines. There was one, I want to say it was called Moves, but it was basically really about the actual mechanics of play and like giving you tips on how to play these board games. Whereas Strategy and Tactics would, like reviews. Again, it had the full games in there, but then it also, there were articles in there that were specific to military history where they would talk about ancient battles, but it was unique at the time for covering them from a sort of historical and a very analytical standpoint, as opposed to like sort of these heroic tales that we would have read about growing up. And so it was a little bit unique and kind of groundbreaking in that way. So eventually in 1980, the company SPY, they end up publishing yet another magazine called Ares. Now, Ares was going to focus on science fiction and fantasy gaming, much like what Dragon did. Okay, so that was their competitor to Dragon, just like Strategy and Tactics was kind of their version of a competitor to Avalon Hill's The General. All right. And then later on, eventually SPY is acquired by TSR in 1982. And TSR tries to continue publishing a lot of Strategy and Tactics magazine, but also the board games. And then eventually they ceased that in 1987. And those assets are sold off. But there is going to come a point in time, and we're going to get that in the history of Dragon, where the Ares magazine that was owned by SPY becomes a section within Dragon that covers science fiction and superhero role-playing games in the back of the section. And then the front of the section was dedicated, or the front of Dragon was dedicated to fantasy games. All right. So just kind of a little peek ahead to what was going on there. The General itself ceases publication in 1998 when it is, when the company Avalon Hill is acquired by Hasbro. And Hasbro did for a while think about, can we have Wizards of the Coast, because they were acquiring Wizards of the Coast at the same time. Can we have Wizards publish, you know, the General and the stuff by Avalon Hill? And they eventually didn't do that, right? I guess the thought was like, there's too many magazines out there. Okay. But I'm just showing you how everything is related. All right. So you have these magazines that were dedicated again to an industry that was again kind of a niche industry, but it was the way, because, you know, no internet at that time, these magazines were ways of getting out information about the games that these companies were publishing. So you could alert people at a time like, hey, this is coming, or you could answer questions that people wrote in about how to play the game so that everybody could see. All right. So you also have another kind of subset, but it is very related to the idea of these professionally produced magazines, which are called APAs, Amateur Press Associations, and they're zines. Okay. And one of the most famous for our purposes, okay, was one called, and my French is terrible, apologies. It's Liasons Dangereuses, I believe. And it was a magazine that was, or a zine, I should say. It's a fanzine that is dedicated to a game called Diplomacy. Now, again, everything comes full circle, right? Diplomacy was a war game that was published by Avalon Hill starting in 1958. And it was unique at the time for its negotiation phase, but also that it didn't use dice to resolve conflicts. There was no random element in the game. So that was sort of unique. And a lot of people started making these zines that were dedicated to diplomacy, and they called them Dippy zines. So if you ever see that name anywhere, Dippy zines, it's a diplomacy fanzine. Okay. So one of the people that started this, or actually it's the guy who started Liasons Dangereuses, is a man named Len Lakofka. Now, Len had been playing diplomacy. He met Gary Gygax in 1968 because Gary at the time was the vice president of the International Federation of Wargamers, and Len Lakofka had joined that group and met Gary. That's how he kind of got brought in. So as early as 1975, his zine on diplomacy that he started in 1969, I think it was, to cover diplomacy, as early as 1975, he starts including articles in there about Dungeons and Dragons, and they're written by Len, but he credits them to he and Gary Gygax, even though it is documented. If those things were 100% written by Len Lakofka, he put Gary Gygax's name on there because he was trying to help Gary preserve his copyright and ownership of the Dungeons and Dragons game. And later on, a lot of those articles that were originally published in Liasons Dangereuses are going to be republished pretty much as is in Len Lakofka's column, called Lehman's Tiny Hut, that is in Dragon magazine. Okay. So again, everything's going to come full circle. So, we've talked about Liasons Dangereuses before when I talked about the origin of the illusionist class. So you can see that video up here. All right. So that's just a tiny bit of background. Now, Strategic Review. I first heard of the Strategic Review when I got this magazine. This is the Best of Dragon. It was published in 1980, but I wouldn't have gotten it until years later, probably a couple years after even I got this. I didn't even know this existed. So I see the Best of Dragon, and it says from the Strategic Review. And then on the inside, it tells you that it's covering material that was in the Strategic Review. And this was my first time knowing that there was a magazine that predated Dragon magazine. And I thought, that's cool. I'd love to see those someday. I never did until this came out. So my mom gave this to me as a birthday gift. This came out in 1999. This is the Dragon magazine CD-ROM, 250 issues of Dragon magazine. Probably my favorite Dungeons and Dragons product that I'd ever gotten up until this point. Later, my mom gave me an original white box, which was, superior to this, but at the time this was amazing because it gave me access to all these issues of Dragon that I didn't have, that I couldn't have read at the time. And so I loved this. I thought it was amazing that I could get all these things. And this included all 7 issues of the Strategic Review. Now, this has kind of a storied history. We'll cover that a little bit later, but essentially there were people that were upset because this included all of the artwork, the cartoons, the cover art, and all the ads. in every magazine. And there were thoughts that maybe they didn't have the rights to actually do that because those rights were only given for print publications. In any event, I'm now going to turn it over to talking about the strategic review. Now, unfortunately, I don't have any issues in print to hold them up. So, and that's going to be the case for about the first 40 to 50 issues of Dragon as well. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to show them to you on screen instead of in person. I kind of like flipping through them and showing you guys things that are in here. But I'm going to do this on screen so you can see. So I'm going to flip it over to now looking at my screen. And I'm going to apologize in advance if the audio quality changes a little bit, because I'm going to go from standing above my phone and recording to recording it from the side. And so, again, just apologies if it changes at all. Okay, so now we're going to look at some of the issues of strategic review. We're actually going to look at all of them, starting with the first issue, Volume 1, Number 1. This is Spring from 1975. And you can see here it was 50 cents was the cost. And then it goes on in the publisher's statement, and it mentions how you could buy them for 50 cents each, or you could subscribe for a full year. These were quarterly issues. So you could subscribe for a full year for $1.50. And so you're going to save 50 cents to get 4 issues. So again, quarterly issues. This is spring of 75. This is about a year after Dungeons and Dragons has come out on the market. And TSR at the time was also publishing other games. It was publishing a game called Cavaliers and Roundheads, which was the game it published originally to try to make money enough so that they could publish Dungeons and Dragons. And that is a war game. And so this particular magazine exists to cover basically everything that TSR was involved with at the time. And you'll see it says it's going to cover military miniatures, games, and swords and sorcery. And so at this particular point of time, role-playing games as a genre of games really didn't I don't want to say they didn't exist. They existed, but nobody was calling them that. Everybody thought of games like Dungeons and Dragons were sort of just a subclass of games, of war games. So that's how it was thought of. So that's what this game was originally, or this magazine was originally intended to cover. So you see, it says what's going on here. So this is all written by Gary, for the most part, Gary Gygax. So he says it's a newsletter. So it's 6 pages, and he says it's going to carry advertisements for all of TSR's product line. I'm not going to give this much into the weeds on all these issues, by the way. I'm just going to cover on this first one so you kind of get a sense of what strategic review was like. And so he talks about how it can feature other games from other companies, but because this is the first issue, they didn't have any contributors for this, so it's all going to cover just TSR stuff. So he mentions that it will include the Strategists Club. We'll get to that in a second. A creature feature in which each issue is going to introduce like a new monster to the game. It's going to have the Armory. It's going to have Castle and Crusade, TSR News, and Wargaming World of News and brief reviews. So it's pretty much what you'd expect. So let's just kind of dive in here and see what's covered in this particular issue. In the publisher's statement, they mentioned that if you don't, include a stamped envelope with your submissions, that can't be returned to you, and that nothing from here can be reprinted in whole or in part, all standard kind of stuff here. It mentions that the editor is Gary Gygax, and the assistant editor is Brian Bloom, who are, sort of 2 of the 3 founders of TSR, or Tactical Studies Rules, I should say. So introducing the Strategist Club. So this is basically a special association that they created only to TSR subscribers. So this is going to go away after a while, but eventually there is going to be the Role-Playing Game Players Association, and kind of a similar concept. But at the time, it was called the Strategist Club, where basically they were going to do an award show at Gen Con. And they wanted the people as part of this club to be able to vote on things like the best new game of 1974, which I just think is funny because I'm guessing they were hoping that would have been Dungeons and Dragons that would win based on the people who would be subscribing to, or be members of the Strategist Club. But they're, outstanding designer, writer, wargaming magazine, miniature figure release, and then your favorite sword and sorcery novel of 1974. And then they mentions that if you belong to the club, you get a discount coupon when you purchase things from TSR. So then we see a section on TSR news. And so it talks about how they've acquired the rights to publish Chainmail, Don't Give Up the Ship, and Tractics, which are all games that were published mostly by Guidon Games. So we talked about that a little bit before with Chainmail. So now TSR is going to start publishing that. Tractics is a World War II war game, miniatures game. And Don't Give Up the Ship was a naval game that actually Dave Arneson helped work on. So some concepts like saving throws in D&D, a lot of those kind of come out of Don't Give Up the Ship and that war game tradition. All right, so it talks about that. When you see here where it says D-Guts, so that's Don't Give Up the Ship. And that brings us to a kind of an interesting point in this newsletter here, is that Gary uses a lot of abbreviations and never explains them. And the implication is that if you were following these games and you were part of this community, you had heard all of these abbreviations before, and so they wouldn't be new to you. You would be aware of what they were. So a lot of times he says AH instead of Avalon Hill. He'll say LG instead of Lake Geneva, which is where the city where TSR was located at the time. So he uses things like that because this community was so small. It's hard for us to imagine now with the millions of people that have played Dungeons and Dragons over the years. But at this very dawn of the hobby, most of the people that were playing this game probably learned it from Dave or Gary directly by playing it at a Gen Con or another convention where they appeared. And so they would have had this common language that they used. So they would have known what they were talking about when they used these abbreviations. And I think it's kind of an interesting peek into the early days of the hobby, just to see like how small it was that you could say something like that with the expectation that everybody would know what you were talking about. All right. So that's kind of going to cover the TSR news. They talk about wanting to produce some new Dungeons & Dragons supplement books. And then you get to the creature features. And you see here the first appearance of the Mind Flayer. So this is an iconic monster from D&D. It's one of the few that Wizards of the Coast has held on the intellectual property rights for. So it's not in the OGL. And it made its first appearance here in Strategic Review #1. And it's just funny that it's a very not complex, but it's a very rich culture with the Mind Flayer. It's such a huge part of D&D's history, and yet it's just in this tiny little section here explains everything that you needed to know at the time on how to play a Mind Flayer. All right, now the idea that I heard was that Gary Gygax was influenced by seeing the cover of a book, and on that cover there was some like tentacle-like creatures. And so he saw that, and because he really liked that, he ended up using that to make up this Mind Flayer monster. All right, so sorry if you hear clicking. That's just my mouse as I'm going in between images here. So there you have that. Then you have the section on Wargaming World, which I find really interesting because really what this column is, for the most part, is talking about other magazines and zines that exist that you might be interested in if you want to follow these war games. So this is a great place to figure out like what was being published at the time and see this list grow and develop over time as Gary covers them. And he kind of gives you a review on like whether it's worth it or not. So an interesting one in here is one that would have been very close to him, which is the Great Plains Game Players newsletter. So if you saw my video on the history of the thief or rogue class, you'll know that particular newsletter has kind of a huge part in the history of D&D, because that is where the thief class first debuted. So Gary in there talked about having talked to some folks at Aero Hobbies out in Santa Monica, California. They actually developed the thief class, and one of the guys that was in that game called Gary Gygax, told him about it, and Gary took notes while he was on the phone and wrote the thief class originally in the Great Plains Games Players newsletter before it was eventually published in Greyhawk Supplement 1. All right, so he talks about that. He talks about Wargamers Digest. and how it was, trying to become the dominant publication in the miniature aspect of the hobby. He talks about Avalon Hill and Spy, so we talked about that already. And so that's it. Then he goes into a section called the Armory. Now, he mentions that that's going to be, in his introduction to this newsletter, he mentions that the Armory is going to be an ongoing column. He never says what it is. He just says the Armory is going to be here. But as you read into it, basically what he's doing here is giving rules clarifications, and in this particular case, for the game Tractics. All right. Then there's this tiny little note down here about playing a postal Dungeons and Dragons variant. So these games over time are going to become known as PBMs, or play by mail games. And this was a way that you could play Dungeons and Dragons with people by mail. And this is snail mail, folks. It's not email. So you're writing a handwritten letter where people would write back and forth and play games that way. And it mentions that it's a game combining D&D and a game called Midgard. Now, Midgard has a unique place in the history of Dungeons and Dragons and wargaming history, but it was a D&D-like game that was developed almost concurrently with D&D in the very early 1970s. So prior to D&D being published, while Gary was working on D&D, there was a game being created called Midgard that kind of was the same concept, even though mechanically it worked differently. So anyway, this person that has this magazine here called Fantasia and is going to be running a play-by-mail game. And so he writes about that. All right, then you get to Castle and Crusade. This is another column that Gary Gygax talks about that doesn't tell you what's actually contained in this column. It's just that it's going to be in here. And so he talks about the Castle and Crusade Society, which originated by the Lake Geneva Tactical Studies Association. And it's basically a group of people that, were talking about the medieval era of warfare. Okay, so that's kind of what it was about, and they did it within the context of gaming. And so this particular article is about using the spear in man-to-man combat. It's a whole article or a whole column about using spears in war games involving Middle Ages time period. All right, so just kind of funny. You see a thing here on coming next issue. And then there's this section here, very interesting, on solo dungeon adventures. So again, this is right out of a year after D&D is developed. And they're already talking about, is there a way that you can play D&D without a referee to play it solo? And so it's basically just starting out. He says the upper level above your dungeon, where your solo adventures take place, should be completely planned out. The first level is always begun with the room. That's a stairway that leads down to the room, so you go immediately to table 5. So he talks about how to run this, and it's basically using these tables and rolling dice to see which way the map's going to turn, what's going to happen, what's in a room once you get to a room, and where the treasure is, and things like that. So what's really fun about this, I think, is that the majority of this specific article here is going to be lifted up and then included in the 1979 first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide. So again, we're seeing things that first take place in strategic review that are going to become part of the core of the game. And so this article is a good example of that. Also the Mind Flayer, obviously. But this idea that you could play solo there's a whole section in the Dungeon Master's Guide about doing that. All right. So this is a pretty long article, and we have some ads here for some other games. Warriors of Mars was a, sort of like John Carter type, like that sort of thing. It was a game that TSR was publishing. They eventually had to stop publishing it. It's very, very rare to find these days because they didn't have the rights to it. They just kind of published it without securing the license to do it. And so they had to eventually put that game, stop publishing it. There's a section here on Star Probe, a complete game, a space game that they did. It's a war game. I guess you'd call it a war game. It's a board game. It's not a role-playing game. And then you see just the list here of the things that they were publishing at the time. It's pretty small, but we're going to see that list grow. All right. So that's it. That's the 6 pages that you see in issue number 1 of Strategic Review. All right, now we're going to start to go through the remaining issues of the strategic review. This is going to be a little less in depth, but as you're looking through this, if you see specific things that you want to see me come back and cover or go into more detail on, just, let me know in the comments. I'm trying to not make this video like several hours long and just kind of hit the highlights. So this is issue number 2, volume 1, number 2. This is summer of 1975. Again, this is a quarterly magazine. You see the layout's very, very similar. Not a lot of artwork going on here, very minimal page layout. Partly that was just due to the technology that was available at the time. So right out the gate on this one, we see it's kind of a sad note, but the issue was dedicated to the memory of Don Kay, who passed away way too early. I mean, just much, much, much too young. So Don Kay was one of the 3 founding members of Tactical Studies Rules. It was Gary Gygax and Don Kay, and then Brian Bloom. And Brian Bloom was brought in basically because Gary and Don together did not have enough money to do what they wanted to do, which was to afford to publish Dungeons and Dragons. They had some money, but not enough. And Brian Bloom had the money. And so he kind of came in and he became the 3rd member. All right. But if you look at the logo for TSR, Tactical Studies Rules, at the time, you see it here. A lot of people might not know this, but that logo, that G and the K, that's for Gygax and K. That's what that logo was. So it was used very briefly because Don Kay died so early. And so then, Tactical Studies Rules is kind of dissolved and TSR Inc. is founded. And at that point, the logo changed. Okay, so, starting off on a bit of a sad note, but it's nice to remember Don Kay because he is important to the foundations of the hobby, and he's often forgotten just because he passed away so young. Brian Bloom then takes over the editorial column in this issue, TSR, Why We Do What We Do. So the focus of this article is essentially that they are gamers first. First and foremost, they are gamers. So he's making it, he doesn't say this, but it's very clear. They're not really business people. They did this because they're gamers. And so they wanted to start something because they're fans of that. And then he does go a little bit into some game design philosophy and basically says that games are there to be fun. They're games. That's part of the name. And so he does talk a little bit about rules, maybe not seeming realistic or authentic because, maybe they don't, have that like complete historical realism, but he's saying he's trying to balance that against, the playability and to have fun of a game. And that's something people still struggle with today. I see lots of people talk about, especially the combat elements of D&D and how unrealistic it is that, armor makes it harder to be hit as opposed to absorbing damage and all these things that they think would make it more realistic. And a lot of those rules were made, they weren't arbitrary. They were done to make the game move faster. And, it's a simulation. It's not meant to replicate the realism of combat. Okay. And again, a lot of people, I think, just don't understand that, especially when they first come into the game and they start thinking about things that don't make sense, which I get. I mean, I did that too when I started playing. And then over time, as you learn why these rules were the way they were, they start to make a little bit more sense. So that is his column in here. Essentially to kind of kick off the issue. Then you've got this Return of the Strategist Club. And in here it tells you you pay $2 to register. That covers the cost of this banquet that's going to be at Gen Con, where they're going to reveal all these awards that they want you to vote on. So you're paying for the banquet, but you're also paying to vote on the rewards. But then they also get into some very early kind of market research where they ask you to say, tell us what you're interested in. What do you want to see us cover? And rate these things on a scale of 9 to 0. Very typical Gary. He can't do 1 to 10 because that would have just been too easy. He has to say, on a scale of 9 to 0, where 9 is wonderful and 0 is like you don't care. So, and then, you get your discount coupon, things like that. There's rules in here again for Cavaliers and Roundheads, that game that we talked about earlier. So these are rules additions for that game. And then in the wargaming world, again, he's covering new publications that are coming out. So he talks about 2 magazines that are going out of business, ceasing publication, Battle Flag and El Conquistador. But he talks about the Midwest Gaming Review. Wargamers Information is in here again. He talks about, just a bunch of different magazines. So again, this is just a fun thing to read. I like reading about these early magazines and sort of like where they come from and who was publishing them at the time. So then he gets into questions most frequently asked about D&D rules. And again, very typically Gary, he switches on to marketing speak and basically says there were space limitations that prevented him from getting into detail and all these things. I think it's pretty well known that a lot of these things, it didn't occur to him to explain it at the time because either he thought that people would just get it, that would understand it, or he hadn't actually thought of it until people started asking questions. He's like, yeah, I need to come up with a rule for that. Gary was famous for kind of saying like, I can make a rule for that if people had questions, rather than the Dave Arneson way, which was sort of just, you make a ruling, but then you just kind of move on. Gary very much wanted to kind of like document it. Dave was more known, from what I understand at least, for wanting to put a lot more of that into the hands of the DM or the referee, and let the referee sort of make those decisions in the spur of the moment based on the context of what was happening, and then keep the game going. So you have to be fair when you do that, but it doesn't necessarily mean you have to have everything written down. Gary liked to try to write everything down. And so that's why you see a game that's as simple as D&D when it is first released become this very rules heavy game when you get to AD&D just a few years later. But anyway, he goes through here and he talks about examples of combat and how it works and how you have to roll initiative. It's always checked, and surprise naturally allows the first attack in many cases, and like things that you would think would be, just you would just know how to do that. Like there's really no initiative system in Dungeons and Dragons until people started asking like, how do you know who attacks when things happen? And so he had to come up with a rule for that. Okay. And so then that comes later. So you go through there. Then the creature feature here presents the Roper. So this is the first appearance of, again, another classic D&D creature that's been around since we would think the very beginning, but it debuted here in Strategic Review. We also have the debut of the Ranger class, not by Gary Gygax. This is by a man named Joe Fisher. We talked about this. If you see my video on the history of the, I covered 5 classes. So it was the Cleric, Paladin, Ranger, Illusionist, and Bard. So there's a video about those 5 classes, and I do talk about this article here and the Ranger class. Then you've got Gary coming back with his some of his polearm. He's really into polearms, folks. So he wrote this whole article here. He's going to write a sequel to this, and eventually all of this is going to be gathered and put into Unearthed Arcana, a handbook for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons that comes out in 1985. But he's got this whole article here on different types of polearms, and then all the statistics for them. And so you see that the stats here are mainly for the chainmail man-to-man combat table. So let's talk about that for a second. Why is that in there? Why chainmail and not D&D? So remember, chainmail was not originally published by Tactical Studies Rules or by TSR. It was published by Guide on Games. However, Tactical Studies Rules eventually does get the rights to publish it because Gary was part of Guide on Games. And so when he helps co-found Tactical Studies Rules, he wants his rules back in-house, so to speak, so that he can do that. Now, what's interesting is that in original Dungeons and Dragons, the combat system that we use today was not the combat system that was used. It had its own unique combat system, but then there's a footnote in one of the tables or in one of the pages that says you can run combat using the man-to-man combat system from chainmail. So requiring you to buy another game if you wanted to use that, or you could use the D&D combat system. Well, what's really interesting is that the man-to-man combat system from chainmail, that ends up becoming the default combat system for Dungeons and Dragons that we still use today. So it was originally part of another game. So that's why even here as early as 1975, this article, which is very much not a lot of mechanics in it. It's mostly about the history of these different polearms and like what they looked like and how they were used and who used them, like what kind of troops. But the small bit here on the mechanics is done for chainmail, but that was also done because Gary knew that people were switching over to using that system to play D&D. All right, so that's that. Then there's some news on TSR and talking about how they're going to start distributing games from other publishers. So that's a little bit in this section. here. And then you get to an article on Panzer warfare. So this was a war game, again, a World War II war game. And Brian Bloom writes an article here on additional unit organizations. So you can see this is not a D&D focused magazine. At the time, it's still split, talking about these war games that sort of preceded Dungeons and Dragons, because they, at the time, people kind of thought like that was where the industry was going, was these like miniatures war games. Now this increases the page length from 6 to 8 pages. All right. So that's issue number 2. Now we're going to go to issue number 3, volume 1, number 3. This is autumn 1975. And here we have another editorial, this one by Gary. And this is an interesting one because, again, this is typical Gary, who's calling out people that have criticized things that he has done. And so he's speaking about a review that was written about chainmail and Dungeons and Dragons by a man named Hendrick. Last name is Hendrick, and his first name, I want to say, it's Arnold Hendrick. Okay, so basically Gary says like this guy's criticizing things and he's full of it, doesn't know what he's talking about, and Gary goes on to make fun of him in his very typically overly wordy language that Gary uses. And what's interesting is that Arnold Hendrick does go on to become a game designer of his own. He has a very small catalog of games that he does in the tabletop gaming industry, but he does go on to do a lot of stuff in the computer game industry. So it's just funny to see him mention here. He's reviewing games for the War Gamers newsletter, and he had some issues with Dungeons and Dragons. Now, what's interesting is I don't think the issues that he has were all that devastating. And in fact, it seemed like he quite liked the game. He just thought it was minimally explained, which is true. So if you look up Arnold Hendrick and just look up Arnold Hendrick, review of Dungeons and Dragons, you can find links to it and read the review. And I actually thought it was a pretty fair review when I saw it. So that's that. Then you have your TSR news, where it talks about how TSR is expanding and it's creating these new divisions. And this is because this is in the wake of Tactical Studies Rules having to be disbanded after the death of Don Kay. So it didn't happen immediately. His Don Kay's wife was made a partner for a while, but she eventually didn't want to do that. And so they had to buy her out and kind of dissolve the company and then start over again. So that's kind of what this is about. They don't get into the details of why they're doing it, just talks about doing it. It talks about how they're going to be publishing Mike Carr's classic Fight in the Skies. If you saw my video on the history of TSR boxed games, box set games, I talk about Fight in the Skies and the history of that. So make sure to check that one out. It's actually a really fun video. I loved putting that together because I loved box games, and I would encourage you to watch that. So then they talk a little bit about doing a supplement on Blackmore. They talk about making this game called Classic Warfare, which is going to be funny because it's going to be coming soon for like almost a year. So that's kind of it for the TSR news. Then you get to your creature feature, and there's a ton in here this time. So you've got a Yeti or abominable snowman. You've got the shambling mound. You have leprechauns, shriekers, ghosts, which is, odd, not part of the original game. Debuts in Strategic Review. Nagas, windwalkers, piercers. Okay, so the lurker above, all of those debuted here in Strategic Review before they were made part of the core rules. All right, so then you have this goofy article, and this is where you start to see one of the first times of using humor. And so a person by the name of Wesley Ives writes this article where he talks about different monsters, but they're all just like goofy versions of different kinds of players. So you have, for example, Bydras and Weregamers and Grifferees and things like that. And then he talks all about them in this little article here. It's kind of funny, but it's just, it's the start of, eventually Dragon Magazine is going to have an annual April Fool's issue that is just all full of humor. And you kind of start to see the seeds of that idea here. You have more information here on the Strategist Club that we've talked about before. Then you've got some, an article here on running the Battle of the Ebro River for using 5mm Napoleonic figures. Okay, so that's a whole article on that. And so you see these, like, it is a very homemade style of, like, look at these maps. It's very clearly just kind of hand drawn, probably with a marker. So you have that, and then you have an article on the Gallery of Gunfighters. So this is actually going to be written by Brian Bloom, and this is for the Boot Hill game because he was a huge Western fan. He liked it, and so was Don Kay. And so I mentioned this in my box set video. We talk about Boot Hill, and so you'll hear more about that there. But that's why this is in here. Now, this is kind of fun. From the Rivenstar songbook, The Unicorn Song by the Moonwolf of Rivenstar. And then it says also known as Michael Longcore. So Michael Longcore is a filk singer. He was inducted into the Filk Hall of Fame in 2014. He's still around. He still makes songs. But it's fun to see, like, he is famous within that world. Again, it's a very small universe of people that are into that kind of thing. But within that universe, he is one of the main stars. And you see all the way back here in 1975, he had a song. So, almost 50 years ago, he was writing this song in Strategic Review, which I thought was really neat. So then you have this article here called Mapping the Dungeons. This is essentially giving addresses and places where you can go play D&D, where you can find a dungeon master, right? So where there are clubs that feature D&D games. So you see they're starting to understand that they need to call this out and let people know where you can play this game because the game is becoming very popular and they want to capitalize on that. They want to lose that momentum. So probably the most famous person in this list here is Rob Kuntz, who does eventually become an employee of TSR. He and his brother Terry. And so Rob Kuntz is, if you've ever heard the wizard Robilar, that is his character. So that's that. And then you have this article on the deserted cities of Mars. So this would have been written to coincide with the publication of the Warriors of Mars board game. We talked about that in the last, one of the last issues. There was an ad for it. So this article, it's not really mechanics. It's really just about the kind of aesthetics, if you want to call it that, of what a Martian city would look like from that Barsoom Edgar Rice Burroughs standpoint. So James Ward or Jim Ward ends up also becoming an employee of TSR later on. He writes Gods, Demigods, and Heroes, which is supplement 4 for original D&D, and then eventually revises that to become the Deities and Demigods book, later renamed Legends and Lore for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. He also does Metamorphosis Alpha, which is the first science fiction role-playing game, and in 1976 for TSR, and then Gamma World, post-apocalyptic role-playing game. He does a lot more as well, ends up becoming one of the people who runs TSR after Gary Gygax leaves, one of the main people on the executive committee, and is there almost until the very end, right before it is acquired by Wizards of the Coast. So that's Jim Ward, and he writes this article again on, creating cities in Mars. And then you see this product list here of TSR Hobbies. Now, this logo here, this is the new lizard logo for TSR Hobbies, and this is illustrated by a person named Greg Bell. He's going to come up in a minute later. All right. And so that's that. You've got your product list here. You see it's growing bigger and bigger. Now you see all these things here like the Siege of Minas Tirith, the Battle of Helm's Deep, the Battle of Five Arm. So these games were sold by TSR Hobbies, but they weren't created by them. They are essentially distributing them, offering them for sale, but they're not games that they themselves are making. Okay. But some of these are. You also see that they now have a European distributor and an Australian distributor. So the company's growing, which is really interesting because in issue 2, Brian Bloom was talking about how they weren't a big company. And now here in issue 3, we see that they have an Australian and a European distributor. So that's issue 3. Now, issue 4, Winter 1975. Volume 1, number 4. So they talk about how they're going to go bi-monthly now instead of being quarterly. They're going to be bi-monthly. So it's getting bigger. Gary Gygax writes the editorial here and just talks about people who have joined the group. So Tim Kask has joined as periodicals editor. So Tim Kask is still around, but you see he was there at almost the very, very beginning And but he has a YouTube channel that you can go to where he talks about, sort of the early days and answers a lot of questions about, people will write into him and ask questions, and he'll do whole videos where he just answers people's questions about what it was like back in the day. All right. So he's joining as periodicals editor. They talk about Terry Kuntz. I just talked about him a second ago. This is Rob's brother, Terry, who is working on a game for Robin Hood, but they've moved him into the service manager at the company. And then Dave Arneson is joining. So really interesting. So Dave is, a co-creator of Dungeons and Dragons with Gary Gygax. We've talked all about this before, and but basically he was not an employee until almost 2 years in. So he, he was still doing work, but he wasn't an actual employee until this point. All right. So then they talk about here, you've got your mapping the dungeons section. So this is really interesting because they're talking about sword and sorcery and Conan figures. So this is miniature figures and where all these different areas are and what figures you can use to represent those different kinds of figures. So then it gets into this section here on D&D oriented magazines. So this is where, again, we're covering all these different magazines that exist at the time. And so you have Alarms and Excursions. So this is, I think the first fanzine that was dedicated to Dungeons and Dragons. And so this is by Lee Gold, puts this out. And what's fun about this one, I mean, it's very influential in the D&D community, going again all the way back to the almost very beginning. It is still published today. So that's kind of a fun thing there, is that you can still get issues of that if you want. Alarms and Excursions. But then you have some other ones here. And then you have this mention here that Greg Kostikian is going to be working on a new zine. So he's publishing currently a Dippy variant called Durful. Okay, so we talked about Dippies before. It's a diplomacy magazine, but he's going to be working on a new D&D fanzine. Greg Kostikian ends up becoming a very, again, within this universe, we'll call him famous as a game designer. But very early on, you see he was publishing these different magazines and zines. All right. So that's that. You've got your Dungeon Master listing here. So again, you've got Rob Kuntz listed. Again, is probably the most famous one in that list at the time. You have more words on medieval polearms from Gary Gygax. I told you it was going to be coming back. So you have more on that. You have new weapons for chainmail, and we're getting into some things from, non-Western weapons. So Japanese type weapons here, just a couple. And then there's this article on more again about the Panzer war game, Panzer Warfare, and additional unit organizations, Brian Bloom. So these people are writing these articles mainly because these were games that interested them. So it's not like somebody said, hey, can you do an article on this? They're writing these because these are things that are of interest to them. I highly doubt anybody wrote to Gary and said, can you please do yet another follow-up on your article on polearms? He's doing this out of love. That's just the kind of magazine that this was at the time. It's barely a magazine. It's really a newsletter. All right. So then you have this debut here where they talk about the new game Dungeon. This is by Dave McGarry, comes out of the Twin Cities area, where he was playing games with Dave Arneson and that crew. And so he wrote this game called Dungeon, which is a board game version of D&D, if you want to call it that. It's an oversimplification, but that's kind of essentially what it is. All right. You've got some Tractics articles here. You have Wargaming World, where we're talking about, again, some more magazines here. So the American Wargamer, El Conquistador is coming back. The Game Setter. So Games Letter, excuse me. And then, just a bunch of other magazines here. There's a brief overview of Gen Con 8. And then you have the debut of the Illusionist class. So again, I have talked about this before. The Illusionist class from Strategic Review before it debuts in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Player's Handbook in 1978, written here by Peter Harrison all the way back in winter 1975 in the Strategic Review. Gary basically lifts this up and publishes it. I mean, he has to change it to conform to the AD&D rules because this was written for original D&D, but still, That's where it comes from. Then you have this article in here by M.A.R. Barker, who we've talked about, Professor Barker before, created Empire of the Petal Thrower, and I have a whole video about it, so you can see that video. There's a link here. But here he's basically talking about how to pronounce these names. So again, just an interesting, this whole article, like look how long this is. There's no game mechanics in this whatsoever. This has nothing to do with gaming mechanics. This is how to pronounce the names that he's included in his world and in his game, and like all the fun little, symbols and lettering things that he's come up with. All right. Then you see this little note here. The dragon is coming. The dragon is coming. Doesn't say what it is, just says it's coming. All right. Then you have this ad here for the Empire of the Petal Throne. Again, we just talked about that. Creature feature has the clay golem. And then you have the release of, or the inclusion of this article on magic items. So in here, you have, this is the debut of the Ioun stones, which come from Jack Vance. Now, I've seen this pronounced a whole bunch of different ways, so I know someone's going to come after me in the comments and say I pronounced it wrong. I've seen that it's pronounced Ioun. I've seen it pronounced Ion. I've seen it pronounced Ion. And I've even seen it said that this is actually a Welsh name, and it should technically be pronounced Ewan. But pronounce it however you want, folks. That's fine. But essentially, this is where this concept debuts. So Jack Vance gave them, I guess, permission is what is implied here to use his concept in here as a magic item for Dungeons and Dragons. Then you have this tiny little ad here about Diplomacy World, which is a magazine just for diplomacy. And then you have another ad here on the release of a new role-playing game, On Guard. I've talked about that before. If you watch my video on the history of settings for tabletop role-playing games, you'll see I talk about On Guard there a little bit. Then you've got another article here, The Gallery of Gunfighters. This is, again, going to be written by Brian Bloom, and it's talking about, different rules of characters. This is Doc Holliday and how you could represent him in a game of Boot Hill. Now, you've got a full page ad here of all the things that are available from TSR Hobbies. So you see it's growing, growing, growing. Also, this issue is 12 pages. Starts at 6 in issue 1, and now all of a sudden by issue 4, we've doubled the number of pages to get to 12. All right, so let's quickly go to volume 1, issue 5. So this is December 1975, and now remember, by this point we've gone bi-monthly. All right, and now we have a cover with artwork done by Greg Bell. This is the guy who did the lizard logo, okay? And you have, starting to make it look like a real magazine, okay? Less of a newsletter and more of a magazine. A lot of this is due to Tim Casket coming on board. So Tim is now going to take over this editorial column, which he's going to call In the Cauldron, all right? So he talks all in here about what's going on at the company. Blackmore's back from the printers. You'll be able to buy it soon. That's supplement 2, if you're not aware of that. He talks about the Dungeon Hobby Shop and where it's located. And he talks about there's a catalog that they're going to publish that you can get access to. Just a bunch of stuff in here, again, about what was going on at the time. He talks about Empire of the Petal Throne a little bit. He talks about Fight in the Skies, a new, there's a new version of Little Bighorn, which is a, one of those war games that they were really into. There's the mention again of Robin Hood and Terry Kuntz working on that. And then there's like a mini biography for all of the people that, the main people that were at TSR at the time. So you have Gary Gygax here. And then what I thought was really interesting was, I'm guessing Gary wrote his first. I was born in Chicago 37 years ago. For those of you in astrology field, it was blah, blah, blah. And he writes that. And then Brian Bloom writes his almost the exact same way. It's like he's copying what Gary said and just inserting his own facts, but like he's following the same format. So I don't know why he did that, but anyway, I thought it was interesting. So Gary talks about like kind of how he got into gaming, and it basically asks people to go out and buy all the things that he's written that you can afford so that he can become rich and then get back to playing war games instead of working. And then Brian Bloom essentially does the same thing and talks about, his background. And then that's going to be continued on page 8. Again, if you're a younger viewer, you might not know that in the old days, when magazines like this published, like you would just expect to turn the page and keep reading. They would lay them out very differently. And so often you had to skip a number of pages. I know if you're an old time gamer, you're probably saying, of course. But if you're new, you might not realize that's how magazines used to be laid out. So there's an article here on basically doing a D&D in a World War II type setting. It's more war game related, actually, kind of like as far as the rules and stuff. But it's the idea of like what happens if you have a World War II miniatures game and you want to mix it with swords and sorcery. So that's what this article is about. Okay. And then he just put some rules in here for World War II fantasy battles. Very, very minimal. But it has ranges and damage types and things like that. Here again, we see the dragon approaches with no explanation of what that means. There's a little map here for your World War II fantasy thing. You get into mapping the dungeon again and talking about here how they have copies of Men in Magic and Monsters and Treasure that you can get for $2 each, or both for $4. So then you also have this discussion here on the robe of scintillating color. This is a new magic item. You have prayer beads, and then you have the wargaming world. Again, we're going to talk about all these different magazines that have come out that are, going to be of interest to people who are reading this at the time. All right. And then we get back to our biographies here. So Rob Kuntz, Terry Kuntz, and then Tim Kask, who is the new, going to be the new editor. Then you have this article on the Battle of the Nile by Dave Arneson. So again, Dave's very into these war games. And so he writes this whole article so that you can replicate and play the Battle of the Nile with your Napoleonic miniatures. Okay. And then you've got more modern weapons for the game of Tractics. Again, telling us to beware the dragon. And then we have new gunfighters here, a gallery of gunfighters. And so they cover in here Bat Masterson and some other people like that. And then there's an article on the National Wargamers Convention. And again, the Strategist Club, we're still talking about that. Another discount coupon. And that's it. So this issue has jumped up to 16 pages in total. So little by little, it's getting bigger and bigger. All right, we're going to move to volume 2 of the Strategic Review now. This is volume 2, number 1, which is the 6th issue overall of the Strategic Review. This is from February 1976. Again, you see that we're continuing in this way of making it look more like a real magazine as opposed to a newsletter. We have a cover here. We see the price has gone up to 75 cents. In the publisher's statement, editor is Tim Kask now, and he's pointing out also who the other editors are and who the artist and the cover artist is. So that's kind of a new thing here, giving people credit for the work that they're doing. He talks about, basically what's going to be in this particular issue. And then he talks about some of the games and other things that are coming out for the hobby. So, conventions that are coming out. There's a Play by Mail Star Probe game that's being released. And he basically says, like, the hobby seems to be doing rather well because there's a bunch of stuff coming out. And it's getting to the point where now the decision you have to make is like how to tell the good stuff from the bad stuff. But he's saying it looks like there's a lot of good stuff out there. All right. And then we see this fun article here on the meaning of law and chaos in Dungeons and Dragons. I talked all about this article in my video on the history of alignment and the planes in Dungeons and Dragons. So I'll put a link to that here so you can check that out. But this is where you really start to see in original D&D, if you didn't know, there were only 3 alignments. It was lawful, chaotic, and neutrality. And in this particular article here, Gary starts to say that, like, you can be lawful, but lawful could be either good or evil, and same with chaos. And that's not something he had originally thought about when he put it together. I don't think he thought about it, but he talks about that here. And so starts to kind of create a 5-point alignment system that's going to become part of the Holmes Basic set. And then eventually Gary, of course, breaks that out into the 9-point system that's still in use today and all the way in 5th edition. All right. So you have that article here. It's a pretty long article. And then you have some fiction by Rob Kuntz here, The Quest for the Vermilion Volume. And then you have this new section, Triumphs and Tragedies. This is essentially reviews, but it's not just games. It's also publications and things. It's basically taking the place of some previous articles, but it's where they're going to say, like, this is something you can get, and is it worth it to get or not? So we have that D&D fanzine that Greg Kostikian came out with. It's finally out, and it talks about that here. I know people are going to attack my pronunciation on this. Fire the arquebusiers or arquebusers. I've seen a few different pronunciations on that. I think it's arquebusiers. But then there's also the Owl and Weasel magazine that's coming out. So if you saw my video on the Fiend Folio and the history of TSR UK, you'll be aware of Owl and Weasel, but they're talking about how it's just debuting here in this particular issue. And then the Fantasia Today, that's that. We talked about that a little bit before, one of these issues, which is that play-by-mail game that's sort of a mix between D&D and Midgard. All right, so you have that. Then you have an introduction to Fight in the Skies by the designer of the game, Mike Carr. Mike Carr goes on to design, his games are designed a lot of stuff. Now, Fight in the Skies is probably his thing that he's most well known for, and it's the one game that's been played at every Origins convention. I think it's Origins. Still to this day, it's the only game that's been played at every one. But or it might be Gen Con. I forget. It's one of those two conventions, and I mentioned that in my video on the box game sets for TSR. All right. So then you see again, we've got the Dragon Approaches. They keep talking about this, but not telling us what it means. Then there's the War of Wizards update. This is a sort of like person-to-person combat game that is for the Empire of the Petal Throne setting. So that was a game that came out, and then you've got some updates and rules on that. Got a list here of your dungeon masters or people that run D&D clubs. And again, we see Tim Kaskin here, Rob Kuntz, and Jim Ward being probably the most famous ones on that particular list. Then you have how to play War of Wizards Solitaire. All right. And then this is the debut of the Bard class. So Bards did not exist in original D&D and weren't really a class until this article comes out, February 1976 in the Strategic Review. This is by Doug Schwegman, I believe it is. And once again, this is kind of picked up, and a lot of these ideas that are in here are what Gary uses to create the Bard class that appears in the appendix of the first edition Player's Handbook. So again, watch that video I talked about before on the history of those early classes, and we'll hear a lot more about this particular article. We have Barding Harps as our magic item. We have new Boot Hill rules in here by Brian Bloom. Then you have Gary Gygax adding dwarves and clerics into the game of Dungeon. Again, that's the board game by Dave Magari. Gary's adding some kind of more D&D elements to it. Then there's an article in here about Ancient Conquest, a new game that has come out. And then you have Sage Advice by Thronius. Now, this is going to be Terry Kuntz. And he's providing corrections in here from the Greyhawk supplement 1. Then you have this list of, again, new things that are coming out. It's a continuation of an earlier part of the article, but just basically talking about this is part of that trials and tribulations or whatever they called it. I forget what the name of that article was, but it's sort of the reviews, and so it's talking about these new things. So we see Space Gamer is a new magazine. This one's by Metagaming Concepts. So people are starting to see what TSR is doing, and other companies are starting to say, like, we also need to have a magazine to talk about our games that we have. And so they're starting to become more and more popular, and these were all influenced by things that TSR was doing at the time. So you have that. We talked about alarms and excursions before. We've got this ad here again for Diplomacy World, the Diplomacy magazine. We have all this full page ad here on the new things coming out from TSR Hobbies. And that's it. That's page 16 of this. So again, we have a 16 page newsletter essentially. All right. And then we get to volume 2, number 2, the 7th issue, of all time of Strategic Review. And you see here, it doesn't actually say number 7. It just says The Last. So this is April of 76. First time we've seen any color on the cover of the magazine. It's also, the price has gone up to $1. And in here, Tim Cass says, this is the last issue. He's basically saying he's calling it an obituary, but it's also a birthing announcement. So at this point, what happens is this is going to be the last issue of Strategic Review. And then starting in the future months, it's going to be split into two different magazines. Dragon, which is going to cover fantasy, science fiction, and swords and sorcery. They consider fantasy and swords and sorcery kind of like different. Okay. And then you're going to have Little Wars, which is going to be more of the wargaming stuff, the medieval, but also the Napoleonic, any kind of war games is going to be more in the focus of Little Wars. And they're going to be bi-monthly, and they're going to be published, every other month. So Dragon 1 month, then the next month, Little Wars. You could subscribe to either or you could, or both. But what's interesting in this is it was saying, and it talks in here, if you were a subscriber to Strategic Review and your subscription hadn't lapsed yet when this issue was published, they're going to convert your subscription automatically to Dragon, not Little Wars. So I think it was already kind of seen at the time that Dungeons and Dragons was becoming very, very popular. And most of the questions that people were writing in about, most of the content that people were submitting was about Dungeons and Dragons. And so I think the thought was, if you're reading this, you're probably more interested in that. So you could change it to Little Wars, but if you didn't, it was automatically going to go into Dragon. So each one's going to be 32 pages. They're going to have color, all kinds of stuff. They're going to really kind of increase the quality of these magazines. Okay, so remember, Strategic Review up until this point, the longest issue had been 16 pages. This particular one's 24, but now Dragon's going to be, and Little Wars, they're both going to be 32. All right, so he talks about, more about what's in this issue. Then you have this article here on the Dungeons and Dragons magic system. Now, once again, I talked about this in my video on why do D&D wizards use what's called fire and forget magic. So that comes from Vancian magic system. And Gary kind of explains here why he did that. So watch that video if you want to hear more about that particular article. Then there's an editorial in here, and it's going back to something that came from a previous issue. But essentially the gist of it is Avalon Hill created a new, worked to create a new game convention called Origins. And when it came out, they said it's the first national wargaming convention. And the folks at TSR and Strategic Review took exception to that because Gen Con predated it by quite a number of years. And Gary specifically is kind of like, how would you say that? And this response from the folks at Avalon Hill was, well, Avalon Hill and or Spy are essentially the two biggest wargaming companies, and we haven't been present at every Gen Con convention, and therefore that means it's more of a regional con, and it doesn't really cover the total expanse of the hobby because we didn't show up there or weren't there in force. And so this one is the first one that was dedicated to our companies being there, and so it's the first national one. So whatever, but it's this huge fight in this editorial here. That was a big deal back at the time. Is like going back and forth and sniping each other over who had the first national wargaming convention. So then we have an ad here for Eldritch Wizardry. That's going to be supplement 3 for Dungeons and Dragons, and I have talked about that before. But if you're not familiar with that one. That's where the Druid class first appears as a class for Dungeons and Dragons for player characters that had debuted as a monster earlier. But this is the first magazine where it's a class. And it's also the first supplement where it's a class. And it's also the supplement that debuts psionics for D&D, which, again, if you're new to D&D, you might not be aware of psionics, but they have like a long and storied history of D&D where some editions have it, some of them don't, some of them have it as an option. But psionics debuted originally in supplement 3. All right. Then we have this article here on the fastest guns that never lived. So this is an article by Brian Bloom, but also Gary and Tim. And it's covering fictional characters, the Lone Ranger, Tonto, the Rifleman, Clint Eastwood from his sort of Blondie character or the Man with No Name, from A Fistful of Dollars and all those other movies. But he's got Matt Dillon in here and John Wayne and Paladin. and Yul Brynner from the Magnificent Seven, Hopalong Cassidy, all these kinds of things. So fun article for Boot Hill. All right, you have some comics here. Then you have this thing here, free money. But basically what this is a survey. So again, very early market research by the folks at TSR trying to figure out what people are interested in. So they want to know your age, your sex, your education, how many years you've been playing simulation or war games, or what they call face-to-face games. Now we'd call them tabletop games, I guess. And then, if you prefer, you're given choice of game, style of game. So see how they put role-playing in quotes because that was a new term that was being used. Your favorite period for the kind of games that you play, and how much you spend every month on games, like that kind of thing. Typical market research questions all the way here early in 1976. All right, and you've got your list of dungeon masters again who run D&D clubs. You have an ad for Gen Con 9. And then we have more fiction here. This one is by Jim Hayes. And then you have this article on how to build towns in D&D as a D&D judge, what they called a judge back then, or what we now call a dungeon master. So this fun little article, no mechanics here. This is just about how to create a town for your D&D games. This is by Joe Fisher. It's the same gentleman that created the Ranger class. All right, and then you have some new magic items here. And then you have this fun spread. And unfortunately, because of the way that the PDF is put together, the spread doesn't show the way that it should. But basically, it says discover the dungeon, and it's just showing you like what the TSR headquarters kind of look like. So you see all the games and stuff that they have here. They've got miniatures. And then you see this is Terry Kuntz down here. And then here's Gary Gygax. And then over on the next page, we're going to see Brian Bloom. And then some of the miniatures and things that they have. And so they have a grand opening celebration coming. All right. Then we have this column called Out on a Limb. Now, this is going to actually become part of Dragon Magazine for many, many years. But this is essentially the new editorial column. Okay. So Gary Gygax writes this particular one, and he gets back into this whole argument on the Avalon Hill and, Gen Con and Origins and those conventions, right? So that's, even though they've already talked about it, he talks about it again here. All right. And then they talk again about some more magazines that are coming out: Wargamers Newsletter, Wargamers Digest, The General, the Strategic Review, that, how they were talking about why they did it. The success of Dungeons and Dragons and Empire of the Petal Throne says that it has astounded many of the more stodgy minds in the industry and hobby, because at the time, those games were sort of looked down on. It's hard to think of that now, but the serious players at the time were playing Napoleonic miniatures games, and a lot of them didn't like these new fantasy games that came out. They thought that they were for kids. And so this article is a little bit talking about how, they're very, very successful games, and it's sort of proving those people wrong. And so while the Strategic Review was originally conceived to cover all kinds of games, they've kind of realized that they needed to have a magazine dedicated to just the fantasy style games that were becoming more popular, which is why they have decided to split the magazine into two different, Strategic Review into two different magazines, Dragon and Little Wars. So they talk about that. And then the creature feature here has a couple things. They have the Danebian Slime Devil, and they also have the Ketobelpas. I think that's how I've always pronounced it. I'm sure that's not correct. And then Gary writes this whole thing on ancient and medieval standard military symbols. Again, something that probably he was just really interested in and decided to put it in here. You have an ad here for a new game, the Little Bighorn, a complete boxed game. And then the debut ads for Little Wars, the Journal for the Historical Battle Game Enthusiast, and The Dragon, formerly the Strategic Review. So professional magazine of fantasy, swords and sorcery, and science fiction gaming. So then you have that, and then you have this whole article from Gary on the missile weapon in classic warfare. And so again, very little mechanics in here. There's a little bit, but it's mostly just how to, having bows and missile weapons, slings, things like that. Then buried down here, just this little box section. And speaking of the boxes, you can tell already just the improvement in the layout once Tim Cass comes on board, how much better this looks than the early issues of Strategic Review. But you have this little box section here on thief bonuses for dexterity, which again, we now take for granted. Of course, you're going to add your dexterity bonus to your thief skills or your, whatever you want to call them, rogue skills or whatever. But that wasn't originally the case. And so this article here, it's not even an article, it's just this little table, shows you what your bonus or penalty is to your scores based on your dexterity. And it also includes a table for extraordinary dexterity. So if you had an 18, naturally you could roll percentile dice and increase your dex higher than that. That was never an official rule. There was extraordinary strength if you were a fighter, but that was it. There was no other extraordinary abilities until way later on when Cavaliers get that in Unearthed Arcana. All right, so you have that. Then you have this article here on Empire of the Petal Throne, again by Professor Barker, with some really cool art that goes along with it. And then you have this article here, D&D is only as good as the DM. And Gary in here talks about things like, first, is magic actually quite scarce in your dungeons? It should be. Treasures should be proportionate both to the level of the dungeon and the monsters guarding them. Absolute disinterest must be exercised by the dungeon master. So it's basically just an advice article for how to be a good DM. Okay. But then he also talks about here how quickly people can level up. And so he says it requires no careful study to determine that D&D is aimed at progression, which is geared toward the approach noted above. So, basically slow progression. There are no monsters to challenge the capabilities of 30th level lords, 40th level patriarchs, and so on. So what that means is, again, these are level titles. I just did a short about level titles, a very quick one, a short video. But a lord would have been your top level fighter and a patriarch would have been your top level cleric. Okay. So he's saying like, there's no monsters that can challenge them because they hadn't created things that high level yet. He says, now I know of the games played at Caltech where the rules have been expanded and changed to reflect incredibly high levels, comic book characters and spells and so on. Okay. Different strokes for different folks. But that is not D&D. So we're starting to see Gary get away from those early days where he's basically saying anything's possible and you can play whatever you want as long as your dungeon master figures out a way to make it work. And he's already, as early as 1976, starting to kind of, come from on high and tell people how to play the game. And in his world, you don't play characters at that high level because that's not D&D. Well, D&D is pretty flexible. That sort of thing stretches it too far. And the boys out there are playing something entirely different. Perhaps their own name, Dungeons and Beavers, tells it best. Beavers being the mascot for Caltech. So Caltech, and the reason he's bringing that up is there was a community out here in California where I live. You've got the folks at Aero Hobbies. You had the gamers at Caltech. They were creating variants of D&D very, very early. That's where, again, the thief class comes from, these gamers out here. And they were expanding the rules. And that was a thing that, again, was known. This community was small. And so people who were involved knew that the gamers in California were starting to take the game into new and different directions and expand what had already been done. So Gary talks about that here and basically then goes on to say that based on how long it should take you to acquire new levels, Blackmoor has only been a campaign with a life of 5 years, and Greyhawk has a life of 4 and is the second longest running campaign. And so the most able adventurers should not have yet attained 20th level, except if you have played in one of those two campaigns. So he's basically saying those are the only two campaigns that have been out long enough for someone to have attained 20th level as of 1976. So again, very, very typical Gary Gygax. All right. So then you have, again, an ad here for, you've got an ad for Origins 2, the second convention of Origins. And then you have the availability of products from TSR. And then you have your survey response form. So that's it for our look at the strategic review. Now, this is my first time doing this, so I just decided to cover all 7 of the issues at once. And, as I'm doing that, I realized it is a lot and the video is very long. So if you would prefer that I would just focus on one issue at a time of Dragon, I can do that. It's just going to take forever to get through all 359 issues. So I kind of thought maybe doing it similar to this, where I just focus on, like a year at a time, or, I could even do longer periods of time and not do issue by issue, but just kind of hit the highlights. So, you are the folks that all asked for coverage of Dragon Magazine. So I want to hear from you and how you would like me to cover this in future videos in the series. But, definitely let me know what you thought of this one, and how I could improve it for you when I get into Dragon specifically. All right. So, but again, that's really going to be it for this particular video. So, I hope that you enjoyed it. And, again, I would love for you to go down into the comments and let me know what you think. And, always down there, just put like what you'd like to see me cover in future videos, or, let me know if there's something in this one that I missed that you want to see me provide more coverage on. Also below, you will find places where you can join me on social media, on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter, on Blue Sky. You'll find links to my blog where I share content that I've created. It's mostly edition neutral, but some of the content does have rules that are specific to like the 1981 BX system, but it can easily be converted to any class and level game. So that's all down below. Also below, you'll find places where you can go to my shop and visit my shop, where I have custom designs for t-shirts, hoodies, mugs, posters, things like that feature tabletop role-playing game designs that are exclusive only to my shop. So I would love for your support on my channel, for you to go visit there and buy something from the shop, especially as we're getting into the holidays, so you can give gifts to your gamer friends. And that is going to be it for this video. So thanks again so much for watching. Happy gaming, stay safe, and I will talk to you next time. Okay, and now for the bonus content. What I was drinking, what I was listening to, and I made my notes for this video. There were a ton of notes that I had to make. There were just, 7 issues of strategic review, was a lot to go through. So I had a little bit of this. This is Noble Oak Double Oak Bourbon, which is bourbon whiskey finished with sherry oak staves. So kind of an interesting story in this. I'd never had this before. My wife picked this up the other day. She thought it was interesting. It's made in conjunction with the Edrington Group out of Scotland. They make Macallan and Famous Grouse, Highland Park whiskeys. So this is done in conjunction with them. And then it's not even really a distiller. It's a company, Noble Oak. And they're actually sourcing their bourbon from Indiana. And then they're putting it through they have a process that they do. And it's essentially like fast wood aging. So after they got the bourbon, which all we know is that it has a minimum of 51% corn, because bourbon has to have that. We don't know what else is in the mash bill here. They took it through their fast wood aging process with staves from sherry oak casks. Theoretically, just kind of give it like a smoother, maybe slightly sweeter flavor. So the nose is very, very light. You get your typical, sweet corn. There's vanilla, of course, from the oak aging. A little bit of caramel and brown sugar, maybe. And flavor-wise, it just tastes, it's a very young bourbon. Okay, so it's probably not reached the height of complexity. It's 45 ABV, so 90 proof, so it's a little on the higher end. So you get that alcoholic heat that comes through. But it's nice. It was a nice little thing to sip on. I actually preferred it with a little bit of water. But I don't know. Give it a try if you see it. It wasn't horribly expensive. Okay, and then what I was listening to. So this is Stevie Wonder, Intervisions. This isn't actually my record. This is my friend's. So I've mentioned before, my friend owns a record shop in Burbank called Run Out Groove. So he acquired a group of records, like 700 records, from a neighbor who was a musician and had collected this massive collection of mostly rock, jazz, and soul records. And my friend got his records. And so this one, it's in great shape. So 1973, Motown Records, Stevie Wonder. This has got Too High. It's got Higher Ground, which, Red Hot Chili Peppers covered that. But the original, you've got to hear the original by Stevie Wonder. Just the classic album that he did, where he starts to explore themes of, he's talking about drugs, obviously, with Too High. But there's political ethics in here. There's spirituality, which is really what Higher Ground is getting into, is he's kind of like exploring, sort of more Eastern religions. He was getting into that. There's things in here about urban life and the dangers of that, all covered in this album. Just a classic album. Give it a listen. I'm a big fan. Once my friend gets it cleaned and